Between the early 1980s and the late 1990s, an unidentified killer stalked an area of the Pacific Highway South in Washington, preying on the most vulnerable of women and dumping their bodies around the Green River. These horrific cases were soon attributed to the Green River Killer, whose identity remained a mystery for decades. Finally, in 2001, advancements in DNA profiling led authorities to Gary Ridgway, a 52-year-old factory worker from Utah. For investigators, the news was no surprise. Ridgway had been a suspect in the murders for almost 2 decades. For those who knew him, however, the report of his arrest came as a shock. His wife described him as kind and gentle, while his only child remembered that he was a relaxed man who took him camping and taught him how to play baseball. Today, Ridgway's name brings chills to those who hear it. After his arrest, he was convicted on 49 counts of murder, and today he is considered the second most prolific serial killer in the US. But still, questions remain in Ridgway's case. Just who exactly was this seemingly ordinary man? And what drove him to kill? In this documentary, we aim to shed light on such questions by examining the grisly case of Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February the 18th, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah. He was the second child born to Mary and Thomas Ridgway. Ridgway's older brother, Greg, had been born 2 years earlier, while his younger brother came along in 1952. Ridgway's mother, Mary, had been one of 5 children born in an ultra-conservative Roman Catholic family. According to one of her relatives, Mary's father had taken a hammer to her painted fingernails, breaking them. He was described as a strict, bitter, and misogynistic man. Meanwhile, Thomas Ridgway had endured what his family members had described as a hard life after being taken away from his family by an uncle, living a Spartan upbringing with no love and no tenderness. When Mary and Thomas became romantically involved, her family struggled to see the appeal. Thomas was misogynistic and rough around the edges. Mary was prim and proper. Family members recalled that Thomas was often very outspoken about his disdain for sex workers and wondered if perhaps he was protesting too much. Shortly after they tied the knot, Mary and Thomas moved to Idaho and then to Utah, where they settled down in Salt Lake City. Mary stayed at home, raising their 3 children, while Thomas earned minimum wage working as a truck driver. The 3 boys shared a bedroom and spent much of their time outdoors, with Greg commenting after his brother's arrest, "We literally crawled on our hands and knees over the area around SeaTac, where this series of killings was supposed to have happened." Mary and Thomas struggled to make ends meet though, so much so that when their youngest child, Tom Eddie, developed a fever, they were unable to take him to a doctor. Instead, Mary placed the little boy in a snowbank in the hopes that he would cool off. In later years, it would emerge that the untreated fever had caused Tom Eddie to suffer an element of brain damage. In 1960 though, things turned around for the family. They moved to Seattle, Washington, where Thomas found work as a bus driver and Mary became employed by J.C. Penney. In 1963, they were able to purchase their own house. Ridgway's upbringing is largely described as turbulent, mostly owing to the fact that his father was strict and stoic. A relative recalled, "When they visited us, Tommy was very strict, especially with Gary and Eddie. What upset me was, one time they came and visited us, Gary had a bedwetting problem. His father's idea of how to deal with that was to make him sit in about 3 inches of cold water. I told him I thought it was terrible, and he wouldn't do that again in my house." Notably, Ridgway's bedwetting problem continued until he was around 13 years old. When asked if Thomas was known to physically abuse his children, relatives noted, "Yes, and not just his hand. He took a stick to them." Gary would claim that his father had beaten him with a belt on around 10 separate occasions, and relatives pointed out that he and Tom Eddy were the ones who suffered the most. Greg, by contrast, was seen by Thomas as the son who could do no wrong. He was described as good-looking and quick-thinking, while the other 2 boys tended to follow rather than lead. Relatives stated that Greg noticed the difference in how he was treated compared to his brothers, adding, "He tried to keep them out of trouble and away from Tom. The boys got themselves into situations because they had so much frustration from not being able to live up to what their dad wanted them to be. Greg was the one he set the standard by. He really talked up Greg and his grades." Mary, for her part, declined to intervene, leaving punishments to her husband. Relatives added that Thomas would often become angrier if she interfered. Notably, though relatives believed Thomas was the more domineering partner in the relationship, Ridgway's second wife later claimed that it was, in fact, the other way around, stating that the boys were witnesses to violent arguments between the couple, and that Ridgway once saw his mother break a plate over his father's head at the dinner table. And despite his father's abuse and degradation, it was his mother that Ridgway had an issue with. In an article written by Blaine Harden for the Washington Post, it was reported that Ridgway had admitted to the prosecution's forensic psychologist that as a teenager, he was sexually attracted to his mother. He claimed that he also had vivid memories of her washing his genitals after any bedwetting episode, and that he spent much of his time fantasizing about killing her because he was constantly torn between his lust for her and the shame he felt for harboring such feelings for her. Ridgway also admitted that as a young teenager, he'd stabbed a 6-year-old boy because he wanted to see how to stab somebody. The boy had been lured into the woods before the blade pierced him through the ribs. Luckily, he survived the attack. When he was contacted by prosecutors 40 years later, he reported that Ridgway had approached him and said, "You know there's people around there that like to kill little boys like you." After the assault, the boy ran from the scene while bleeding profusely, and subsequently spent several weeks in the hospital recovering from the injury. His attacker was never caught. Ridgway noted that he was interested in stabbing due to his confusing feelings for his mother, stating, "I thought about stabbing her in the chest or in the heart, maybe cut her face and chest." Ridgway would also later tell investigators that he was a slow learner and a poor reader, leading him to be held back a year in high school, and it was confirmed that he was dyslexic and that his IQ was in the low 80s. Still, he graduated from Thai High School in 1969. In a 2003 article published in the Seattle Times, Ridgway is reported to have dabbled in arson, paid a girl to let him fondle her genitals, and once suffocated a cat, all while he was a teenager. Following his high school graduation, Ridgway worked briefly at a Kenworth truck assembly plant before joining the Navy, where he was sent to Vietnam. Shortly before his departure from the US, he married his 19-year-old high school girlfriend, Claudia Craig. While in Vietnam, he served on board a supply ship and saw combat, with his brother Greg noting, "He spent his time on rivers in patrol boats being shot at. These were things we didn't talk about. His anger about things in Vietnam, if there was any, At one point, he was stationed in the Philippines, and it was at this time that Ridgway first began using sex workers. As a result of his many encounters and the fact that he didn't use protection, he eventually contracted gonorrhea, something which infuriated him. Still, he continued to engage in sexual activity without protection. Around this same time, back home in Washington, Claudia began engaging in an affair. When Ridgway returned from overseas, he discovered the relationship and filed for divorce, telling everyone who would listen that his wife had become a whore. The marriage was soon dissolved, and Ridgway was discharged from the Navy in 1971. He subsequently got a job as a painter at the Kenworth Truck Assembly Plant in Renton, which he held down for 30 years until his arrest. In 1973, Ridgway married Marcia Winslow. Shortly after tying the knot, he became a religious fanatic who would go door to door, attempting to convert friends and neighbors and read the Bible with fervor. He insisted that his new wife follow the teachings of their pastor, and reportedly, he often cried after sermons or reading the Bible. Despite his newfound religion, Ridgway continued to visit sex workers and often pressured Marcia into having sex with him in inappropriate places, including in public and outdoors, sometimes near spots where some of his victims would later be found. Reports agree that as a young man, Ridgway had an insatiable sexual appetite and demanded to have intercourse with his wives several times a day, on top of engaging with sex workers. Marcia also added that Ridgway dabbled in bondage and often enjoyed sneaking up on her. On at least one occasion, he attempted to choke her using a police-like hold. Ridgway himself would later admit that he had a fixation with sex workers, claiming they affected him as strongly as alcohol does an alcoholic. Like his father before him, he frequently complained about their presence. His brother, Greg, reported being surprised that Ridgway engaged with sex workers, but stated, "We didn't sit around talking about those things. Our personal lives are private." In a statement read at his plea hearing, Ridgway claimed that he hated sex workers and didn't want to pay them for their services. In 1975, Ridgway and Marcia had their first and only child, a son named Matthew, who was Ridgway's only offspring. Marcia later reported that Mary, her mother-in-law, was very controlling during their marriage. She apparently controlled the couple's spending and made the final decisions on their purchases, going so far as to buy her son's clothing. She once even accused Marcia of not looking after Ridgway properly. However, Ridgway would never defend his wife, which added to their already fracturing relationship. In 1981, the couple divorced. Ridgway met Judith Mawson 4 years later at a Parents Without Partners function. She would later describe him as a kind and gentle man. Though he was 5 years younger than her, the pair hit it off from the moment they met. Judith, by all accounts, believed she'd hit the jackpot. He was a single father with a steady job who already had his own house, a one-story blue structure near Military Road, a few blocks from Pacific Highway South. 3 years after they met, Judith and Ridgway married. She recalled, "After being with this man for 3 years, I thought my life was perfect." She noted that he always came home on time, never missed a day of work, provided her with his full paycheck, and spent the weekends with her camping or going to garage sales. She labelled him a romantic, and unlike Marcia, had more of a bond with Mary, whose help she greatly appreciated. Between the early 1980s and late 1990s, Ridgway is believed to have taken the lives of at least 71 women and girls, mostly around the areas of Seattle and Tacoma in Washington. Though he would later be convicted on 49 counts of murder, the exact number of deaths he is responsible for remains unknown, with Ridgway himself claiming that he killed so many people that he lost count. Ridgway was very particular when looking for victims. He targeted sex workers in part due to his own love-hate relationship with them, and in part due to the fact that many of these women and girls were vulnerable runaways with nobody to miss them and nobody to report them missing. He often visited areas frequented by sex workers as he looked for victims, including the Tukwila, Kent Des Moines, and Federal Way areas along the Pacific Highway South, as well as Rainier Valley and the China International District in Seattle. He also tried to weed out undercover police officers by watching to see if they were picked up by other clients, and sometimes even asked them to expose themselves before he agreed to pick them up, as he believed undercover officers would refuse. When later speaking with authorities, Ridgway stated, "Prostitutes were the easiest. I went from having sex with them to just plain killing them." His caution likely came as a result of an incident in May 1982, when he was arrested for soliciting a John patrol, an officer posing as a sex worker. The following year, in February 1983, he was caught by a police patrol after picking up 18-year-old Kelly McGinnis from the Strip, the section of Pacific Highway frequented by sex workers, and taking her to a park behind Sunset Junior High School on South 140th Street. Notably, 4 months later, Kelly vanished after being picked up on the Strip. Her remains have never been recovered. Though he didn't have a fixed target profile, Ridgway did prefer to attack white women and girls, particularly those who were younger and less experienced and therefore likely to con him or see through him. He noted, though, that there was the occasional individual whom he let get away, stating, "During the killing spree, there were a few women I didn't. For some reason, I didn't kill them, but they were far and few between." The prosecution claimed that Ridgway developed schemes to help him gain the trust of his victims. He would often show off photographs of his son, offer to become a regular customer, and even tell them he would buy them meals, get them jobs, or let them borrow his truck. Of course, he never held up his end of the bargain. When the Green River Killer began making national headlines in the mid-1980s, he was sometimes asked by victims if he was the killer. He often replied by pointing to his small stature and assuring them that he could never do such a thing. In later interviews with detectives, Ridgway stated that he didn't know who his first victim was or when it all began, but explained that he preferred to kill in his home, the woods, or in the back of his truck. He also always used the same method of execution, where he would go up behind the victim and choke them using either his arms or an item such as a towel or rope. When asked why he stuck to the same method, he replied, "My method's working pretty good. Choking is what I did, and I was pretty good at it." He added that choking was more personal and rewarding, while guns and knives would have been messy. It was mid-July 1982 when the first body was discovered in the Green River in King County, Washington. 16-year-old Wendy Cofield was a young, vulnerable runaway when her life had been brutally cut short. She was strangled to death with her own underwear and discarded in the water like trash. Few people in the local area knew Wendy, and investigators struggled to find a motive for the teenager's killing. Eventually, the case grew cold. At first, it seemed like Wendy's case was an isolated one, but the following month, another body was found floating in the river, about a quarter-mile south of where Wendy had been located. The naked body had snagged among tree branches and logs. Another body was soon recovered from the water. Both 31-year-old Marcia Chapman and 17-year-old Cynthia Hines had been strangled to death. Then a third body was found. 16-year-old Opal Mills still had her trousers knotted around her neck. She was covered in bruises. Marcia had been dead about a week, and Cynthia several days. Opal, though, had died only a day or so ago. Over the next few years, police would continue to find the dead bodies of women and girls who'd likely died at the hands of the same killer. At the same time of their deaths, most of them worked on or had been hitchhiking along the Strip, the name given to the section of Pacific Highway South that was filled with strip clubs and sex workers. And their remains were often later discovered in wooded areas near the Green River and SeaTac Airport. Some of the bodies recovered had been sexually abused post-mortem. The perpetrator was dubbed the Green River Killer. Despite having barely scraped through high school and his notably low IQ, Ridgway was, by all accounts, a very methodical and disciplined killer. For one, he never kept any trophies from his victims. Many serial killers become caught up in their own ego and their need to prove their killing capabilities, but not Ridgway. His home was searched by police top to bottom, and not so much as a single trinket was discovered. He later admitted that he took jewellery from the bodies and sometimes left pieces in the woman's restroom at the Kenworth motor truck plant where he worked, stating, "My favourite thing was maybe if someone's walking around with a piece of that jewellery they found in the bathroom." Furthermore, Ridgway always wore gloves and never picked up a woman unless she was alone. He was known to have changed his tyres on several occasions after he'd felt he'd driven too close to where he'd dumped the bodies of his victims. And although he didn't smoke, he left cigarette butts and gum wrappers around the areas where he disposed of the bodies in a bid to throw off investigators. When one of his victims scratched up his arm, he covered it up using battery acid. If a victim ripped at his clothes, he'd clip their nails before disposing of the body. While he admitted to sometimes abusing the corpses of some of his victims, he claimed it was because it was less risky than killing another woman, not because he found it more arousing. He once even did this when his son was in the back of the truck sleeping. He often placed bodies near landmarks, fallen logs, guardrails, or specific trees, so that he could return to them later, and he always covered them with debris, because she's garbage, so I put stuff over her that was garbage. After his second divorce, Ridgway stated between 1982 and 1984, he spent much of his time killing. He believes in that period alone, he took the lives of at least 42 people. He told prosecutors that hiding the bodies was the most difficult part, complaining that taking the remains all the way out there was a waste of my time and gas. He also added that it was a burden and took the time away from killing. On August 16th, 1982, after the first 4 bodies were discovered, the Kings County Sheriff's Office set up the Green River Task Force to investigate the killings, but it wasn't until spring 1983 that Ridgway caught their attention. That April, 18-year-old Marie Malver disappeared. She was last seen by her boyfriend, Bobby Woods, when she got into the truck of a new client, described as being a dark-haired man between the ages of 30 and 40. Bobby followed the truck but lost the vehicle when he had to stop at a red light. Later that night, Marie failed to come home and Bobby became concerned. He and her father Josie went looking for the truck, which had a distinctive spot of primer on the door. After driving around for several hours, they found the truck in front of Ridgway's house. Police were soon contacted by the 2 men, and officers approached and spoke with Ridgway at his house before leaving. However, Des Moines police were slow to pass on what they knew to King County investigators. It was only 7 months later that the task force learned of Ridgway and interviewed him for the first time. Naturally, Ridgway denied everything. Marie Malver's body is still missing to this day, but after his arrest in 2001, Ridgway admitted to killing her in his home. He also added that he leaned against a fence in his garden during his interview with police back then to hide the scratches Marie had left on his arm. It was these scratches that he later disguised with battery acid. The following month, 21-year-old Carol Christensen's body was discovered in a wooded area in Maple Valley, Washington. The scene around her had been bizarrely constructed, with 2 trout being placed on her body, one on her neck, one on her shoulder, a paper bag pulled over her head, a wine bottle placed on her belly, and a mound of sausage nearby. She had been strangled to death using a fishing line, and police were confused by how her body had been left, speculating that it was some sort of twisted reference to the Last Supper. In 1984, Ridgway passed a polygraph test after being asked if he was involved with the murders. In 1986, task force investigator David Reichert decided to visit Ted Bundy, who was on death row in Florida, after he had written to the detective and offered his help. The pair talked for 2 days, with Detective Reichert hoping that this serial killer could shed some light on the one he was chasing. Reichert recalled that Bundy liked to play mind games, stating, "He talked in the third person all the time, but later we realized he was talking about himself." Though he had a roundabout way of doing things, Bundy was able to shed some light on the Green River killer case. He noted that killers don't just get up in the morning with a desire to kill. They tended to do it when they felt like it and when they felt safe. They also had a deep need to be in control. Bundy believed that the police were giving too much information to the press and believed that the killer was sometimes mocking the police. That the scene set up with Carol Christensen's body was one such example of this. He also stated his belief that the killer was likely revisiting his victims' corpses and abusing them, and suggested investigators set a trap for the killer. In 1987, the way the task force was being run changed. Instead of trying to prove who the killer was, the police attempted to rule out who he wasn't. Those who couldn't be eliminated were moved onto the A-list. Ridgway at the time was still considered a suspect. In 1980, he was reportedly accused of choking a sex worker near the SeaTac airport, near which many of the victims' bodies had been left. When asked about this at the time, Ridgway had admitted it, but claimed it was self-defense. Between this, the incident with the undercover police officer, the fact he'd been caught with Kelly McGinnis, and the fact he'd been questioned in connection with the disappearance of Marie Malva, police felt that though they couldn't yet prove his guilt, they definitely couldn't rule him out of their investigation. He was subsequently moved onto the A-list and placed under surveillance. Upon inspecting his work records, detectives noted that Ridgway was off work on the days that many of the Green River victims had disappeared. Furthermore, he matched the description given by many sex workers who had spotted him cruising around, sometimes with women later found to be victims. Even more interestingly, they learned about his desire to have sex outdoors and found he was familiar with many of the areas used to dump the victims' bodies. Upon speaking with his second ex-wife, Marcia, they found out about the time he had choked her. She also admitted for the first time that on several occasions, Ridgway had come home late at night, his clothes wet and dirty. Armed with all this information, Ridgway's home, which he shared with his fiancée at the time, Judith, was searched, and he was taken into custody on April 8th, 1987. He was given another polygraph test, which he passed, and he allowed police to take his DNA before he was released due to lack of evidence. Despite the progress investigators had felt they'd made, the task force was all but disbanded shortly afterwards, leaving just one officer in charge of responding to tips and keeping track of new information. In 2001, using the DNA samples collected from him back in 1987, Gary Ridgway was finally identified as the Green River Killer. On November the 30th, the 52-year-old was arrested at his workplace and taken into custody. It was later revealed that the saliva taken from him in the 1980s matched the semen left behind in the victims' bodies. 4 victims were named in the original indictment: Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, Cynthia Hines, and Carol Ann Christensen. 3 more names were added after a forensic scientist identified microscopic spray paint spheres on the victims as matching the paint used at Ridgway's workplace at the time of the deaths. On November 5th, 2003, Ridgway entered a guilty plea to 48 charges of aggravated first-degree murder as part of a plea bargain which had been arranged in June that year. The plea bargain meant that he would be spared the death penalty in exchange for his cooperation in locating the remains of his victims, plus providing other details to investigators. Though 2 of his victims had been found near Portland, Oregon, he admitted that he had driven the bodies there to throw off detectives. Prosecutors felt that the plea deal was the best option, as otherwise they would have only been able to charge Ridgway with 7 counts of murder. Deputy Prosecutor Jeffrey Beard stated that the deal contained the names of 41 victims who would not be the subject of the State versus Ridgway if it were not for the plea deal. On December 18, 2003, Ridgway was given 48 life sentences to be served consecutively, without a possibility of parole. He was also given a further 10 years for tampering with evidence for each of the 48 victims. Another life sentence was added when the remains of a 49th victim were found. Ridgway has confessed to more confirmed murders than any other American serial killer. In a 5-month period, he admitted to the murders of 48 people, 42 of whom were on investigators' list of probable Green River killer victims. In one taped interview, he admitted to killing 65 women and girls, while in another, he claimed that the number was 71. During the latter interview, he noted that he had sex with his victims before taking their lives. This detail was not revealed until after he'd been sentenced. Ridgway is currently imprisoned at Washington State Penitentiary. The original Green River Killer Task Force drew up a list of suspected victims back in the 1980s, and from that list, there are still 6 victims unaccounted for. Ridgway has either not confessed to these murders or investigators have not been able to find corroborating evidence. 35-year-old Amina Agashev vanished in July of 1982. Her body was found in April of 1984. Ridgway has denied killing Amina, and notably, she does not fit the profile of his victims. She was considerably older than most of the people he killed and was not a sex worker or a runaway. In 2003, Ridgway confessed to the murder of Casey Ann Lee, claiming that he strangled her in 1982 and left her body near a drive-in theatre near the Strip. Casey was 16 when she disappeared on August 28, 1982. To this day, her body has still not been found, despite authorities' attempts to locate it where Ridgway said it was. Similarly, the body of 18-year-old Kelly McGinnis has never been found, though Ridgway admitted to her murder. He identified the body of April Buttram as Kelly's, and when it was revealed that the body belonged to April, Ridgway stated that he often confused the two due to their similar physiques. He believed that Kelly's body is buried near Lake Fenwick in Kent, Washington, but police searches have turned up nothing so far. 19-year-old Patricia Osborne vanished from Seattle on October 20th, 1983, after she went to meet a man for a date and never returned home. Her body has never been located, and Ridgway has not confessed to her murder. 16-year-old Angela Maria Girdner is also suspected of being one of Ridgway's victims. Her body was found in April 1985 alongside several of his known victims, including Shirley Sherrill, Denise Bush, and Tammy Lyles. As previously mentioned, Ridgway specifically targeted sex workers and runaways, believing that it would lessen his chances of getting caught. With nobody to miss them and report them missing, he was free to continue killing. That isn't to say, however, that Ridgway didn't fantasize about killing people he knew. He confessed that he'd been tempted to kill his mother, along with his second and third wives. He never expressed a desire to kill his first wife, however, despite the fact that she had an affair while he was in the military. It's unclear why. He stated that one of the reasons he wished to kill his second wife, Marcia, was because he didn't want to be labelled a loser for having 2 failed marriages. He reportedly even thought about killing his own son. However, he stated he never acted upon these desires because he knew if someone close to him died, he would be considered a suspect from the start. Blaine Harden wrote for the Washington Post that typically serial killers are the victims of abuse themselves and likely show some signs of mental illness. However, Jonathan Pincus, chief of neurology at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northwest Washington, noted that it takes somebody who is not seriously damaged to get away with it. Similarly, forensic psychologist Reed Meloy added, "His containment is amazing, especially given his pride in what he did. To have strong feelings of pride in one's career as a serial murderer and then not to communicate that to anyone for 21 years is a measure of remarkable discipline." Meloy also noted that Ridgway was extremely meticulous and fervently focused on self-preservation, and stated his sexualized homicidal aggression is very narrowly channeled and does not carry over into any other antisocial behavior. Ridgway himself observed that his ordinary life and appearance helped him get away with the murders for so long, telling investigators, "I look like an ordinary person. Here's a guy. He's not really muscle bound. He's not look like a fighter. Just an ordinary John." And that was their downfall. My appearance was different from what I really was. Still, the motive behind Ridgway's crimes remains unclear. He told investigators that the people he killed meant nothing to him, while the prosecution determined that he suffered from no debilitating mental illness which would have led him to carry out such horrific crimes. They also noted, in 5 months of interviews, he displayed no empathy for his victims and expressed no genuine remorse. He killed because he wanted to. He killed because he could. He killed to satisfy his evil and unfathomable desires. One of Ridgway's lawyers, though, Michelle Shaw, disagreed with the way the prosecution saw her client. She began meeting with Ridgway once a week for 17 months. One day, she told him that his family would always love him, no matter what he'd done. And from this point on, she claimed, Ridgway was a changed man. He reportedly broke down in tears, and did so repeatedly when they met up, and expressed concern that his crimes would ruin his brother's marriage. He expressed relief that his mother wasn't alive to hear the news. She had died 3 months before his arrest. And he told her that any profits made from books or movies about him should go to the victims' families. Shaw added, though, that Gary doesn't fit the profile of anything. He is not a typical serial killer. Many experts believe Ridgway's relationship with his mother contributed to his life of crime. Reed Meloy stated, "For an adolescent, having your mother wash your genitals would be highly exciting and arousing, but it would also be humiliating. With humiliation would come rage towards the mother. That is very common in serial murders. Displaced matricide. Unconsciously, he is killing his mother over and over again." He added, however, that her actions alone were not enough to explain Ridgway's behaviour. Most sexually abused children do not become serial killers. He stated that it's more likely that his mother's actions were like the trigger, setting off something that already existed inside him. For his part, Ridgway told investigators that one big thing missing in him was caring. The news of Ridgway's arrest came as a shock to many of those who knew him. His older brother threw up all night upon reading the prosecution summary. The two siblings had met up regularly and attended family outings together. Greg couldn't believe what had become of his brother. He told investigators that he'd never caught Ridgway behaving oddly. Ridgway's co-workers echoed these sentiments. Judith, Ridgway's third wife, was just as baffled when she received word of his crimes. By the time of his arrest, the couple had been together for 17 years. He still, she said, treated me like a newlywed. Investigators also learned that when she first moved into his one-story home, he had no carpet, and they suspected Ridgway had wrapped a body in the carpet. Judith also noted that sometimes he'd leave early for work, supposedly to work overtime, but investigators felt it was more likely he was out committing crimes. When asked if she missed her husband, she replied, "I miss the man I knew. I hate the man who took him away from me. She suggested that Ridgway suffered from some sort of split personality disorder, stating, "Now I think whenever he left the house, he was a different person. He wasn't the Gary I met." Judith believed Ridgway was innocent for 2 years until he confessed. She stated that she thinks about the victims every day. Interestingly, the number of murders dwindled after Ridgway married Judith, and she reported that this has led her to feel like she has saved lives, stating that by being his wife and making him happy, she helped to prevent further murders. Though the pair divorced in the years after Ridgway's arrest, he continued to write her letters from prison. One excerpt from a letter reads as follows: "I wish I could give you some flowers, plants, candy. You have given me so much. You've given me love. You've cared for me. You've taught me honor and respect. You've cared for me. You taught me courage to go on. Next time you hear the theme song from Titanic, this is the song for you. I will always love you. Gary." Matthew, Ridgway's son, was 28 at the time of his father's 2001 arrest. He was married and living in San Diego. He remembered his father as a relaxed man who never yelled at him. They spent time camping, and Ridgway would always come to Matthew's school concerts and football matches. Even when I was in 4th grade, when I was with soccer, he'd always, be there for me. I don't think I ever remember him not being there. Matthew remembered his mother telling him that his father was being interviewed back in the early 80s in relation to the case, but never in his worst nightmare believed that Ridgway could be the killer, stating, "I think that's how I relate it, that he's just one of the guys that happened to be one place and, he's my dad. He didn't do it, Most of his memories with his father involved Ridgway teaching him how to play baseball near the Green River, as well as going on bike rides through the woods and camping trips to Oregon. Those around Ridgway were convinced that they knew him well, that he was not the monster that investigators were making him out to be. The prosecution, though, disagreed with this stance, repeatedly asserting throughout the case those who thought they knew Ridgway best did not know him at all.